Hello, and welcome back to Tech Fails, the channel where we exhume the ghosts of technology scandals past and dissect what went horribly, spectacularly wrong. Today, we're looking at a product that wasn't necessarily bad, but its failure was a masterclass in terrible timing, questionable strategy, and a company's inability to grasp the cultural zeitgeist. We are diving deep into that failure right now. We're talking about the time Microsoft, the undisputed king of the PC world, tried to take on the undisputed king of portable music, the iPod. Specifically, we are talking about the Microsoft Zune. This project is a classic example of a technology scandal driven by corporate hubris and poor execution. In the early 2000s, Microsoft was sitting on top of the world. Windows was on almost every computer, Office was the essential productivity suite, and their revenue was absolutely astronomical. They truly dominated the personal computer industry. But Microsoft had a major blind spot: consumer electronics. While Sony, Nintendo, and especially Apple were making huge strides in gadgets, Microsoft's efforts often fell flat. Their earlier attempts included the original web TV and even the early days of the Xbox before that console finally found its footing. Then came the iPod, which launched in 2001. It wasn't the very first MP3 player on the market, but it was the first to combine slick design, an intuitive interface, and seamless integration with a comprehensive music store iTunes. This combination made it irresistible. By 2006, the iPod was more than just a successful product. It was an icon. It wasn't just a gadget or a piece of hardware. It was a cultural accessory that defined portable music for an entire generation. Its success created an immediate and very lucrative target. And that's exactly where the trouble started for Microsoft. They looked at Apple's complete dominance in this lucrative space and saw an unacceptable flaw in their own portfolio. They felt they absolutely had to have a large piece of that portable music pie to maintain their consumer relevance. A project was then quickly born to create what they desperately hoped would be the definitive iPod killer. This was a direct mandate from the top levels of Microsoft to compete aggressively with Apple's runaway success. In 2006, the world was introduced to the Microsoft Zune. This was Microsoft's official entry into the digital music player market, intended to dethrone the reigning champion. The first and perhaps most devastating mistake in this whole technology scandal saga was the Zune's launch date. Timing in technology is everything, and Microsoft's timing could not have been worse. Think about this. The original iPod launched way back in 2001. By the time the Zune finally hit shelves in late 2006, Apple was already celebrating the 5th anniversary of its device. They had a massive, insurmountable head start in the market. More importantly, Apple was already in the middle of a massive evolutionary leap in their product line. They had already gone through several iterations of the device. This included the original scroll wheel, the touch wheel, the Mini, the Nano, and the 5th generation iPod, which played video. Apple wasn't just ahead in sales. They had created a moat of user loyalty, strong brand recognition, and a sophisticated ecosystem centered around iTunes. The Zune had to leapfrog 5 years of established cultural and technical dominance. The Zune arrived terribly late, and what's worse, it didn't even arrive with genuinely revolutionary features. Its very first iteration, the Zune 30, was immediately criticized by tech reviewers. The Zune 30 was a bulky, rectangular device that, honestly, looked like an older, less polished iPod. It came in brown, black, or white when it launched in the US. Brown. I'm serious, one of the main colors was brown. Who in product design thought that brown was the appropriate color of cutting-edge, desirable consumer technology? It showed a real lack of aesthetic understanding. This is the classic case of a big company being reactive instead of proactive in the market. Microsoft treated the digital music market like an operating system market. They thought it was a commodity where they could just muscle their way in using their massive corporate power. But they fundamentally misunderstood the emotional and aesthetic connection people had with the iPod. The iPod was a fashion statement and a status symbol, not just a storage device. The Zune was an insular piece of tech that failed to resonate with the youth culture Apple had captured. This massive strategic error led to its ultimate failure to compete. The next major pitfall, and a critical lesson in how not to launch a consumer product, was the disastrous attempt to create a separate, isolated ecosystem. This mistake severely hampered user adoption from the start. Microsoft knew they couldn't just launch a device. They absolutely needed an accompanying music store and software platform. So, they created the Zune marketplace. This marketplace was an entirely walled garden, separate from anything else Microsoft was already doing across their various platforms. It was designed as an isolated world for Zune users only. Unlike iTunes, which was already ubiquitous and fully functional on both Mac and Windows computers, the Zune required its own proprietary software for synchronization. This was an immediate, frustrating hurdle for new users. The user experience was immediately fractured and confusing. If you already use Windows Media Player for your existing music collection, you often had to re-import it all into the specific Zune software. This added tedious extra steps to the setup process. Furthermore, if you were a Mac user, you were completely out of luck. Forget about it entirely. Microsoft initially offered absolutely no Mac support for the Zune. This immediately alienated a significant segment of the most profitable music consumers, who were already dedicated iPod users. The Zune marketplace also used a confusing subscription model called the Zune Pass. This pass offered unlimited downloads for a flat monthly fee. While that sounds somewhat familiar to today's Spotify, back then, the concept was clunky and confusing for buyers. In the mid-2000s, most consumers still wanted to own their music files outright, not just rent them through a subscription service. The Zune Pass was ahead of its time, but poorly executed for the prevailing market preference. This was an insular, isolated experience designed by people who seemed to believe they could dictate user behavior through force of will. They failed to adapt to existing user habits and preferences. This insistence on isolation is a recurring theme in major technology scandals. Believing your brand power alone is enough to overcome a poor, complicated user experience. Microsoft greatly overestimated its ability to shift consumer behavior. Let's move on to talk about the hardware and interface design. These elements also contributed to the Zune's ultimate lack of market success. The Zune 30 featured a squarish design and, most famously, a tactile directional pad, often referred to as a squircle. It was functional and responsive, but lacked aesthetic appeal. It was nowhere near as iconic or as elegant in its operation as the iPod's signature smooth click wheel. The click wheel was a design masterpiece. The squircle was merely utilitarian. The screen on the Zune was a decent 3-inch display, which was actually physically bigger than the contemporary iPod screen. But the overall physical size and bulk of the Zune negated this display advantage. Where the Zune did truly try to innovate was in its interface and, crucially, a feature called Zune-to-Zune sharing. This was an attempt to build a social community aspect into the product. With Zune-to-Zune sharing, you could wirelessly send a music track to another Zune user if they were nearby. On paper, this sounds like a very cool, forward-thinking feature. This feature was supposed to be the key differentiator, the cultural catalyst that would suddenly create a vibrant Zune community. Microsoft banked heavily on this idea of sharing, but there was a massive catch, and it proved to be a deal breaker. Due to crippling fears from music labels about piracy and copyright infringement, any shared song was heavily limited. The recipient of the shared song could only listen to the track 3 times or for 3 days, whichever constraint came first. After that short period, the temporary file would simply disappear from the device. This severe limitation turned a potential killer feature, which could have driven adoption, into a frustrating gimmick. It didn't foster community. It only created annoyance and disappointment. It was a beautiful, forward-looking piece of technology that was completely crippled by corporate fear, internal politics, and restrictive legal constraints. The sharing feature was practically DOA. Microsoft didn't give up immediately after the initial underwhelming launch. Over the next few years, they poured millions of dollars into the Zune brand. They continued releasing what essentially became sunset products in a desperate attempt to catch up to Apple. This included the Zune 8 and 4 inches 2007, which were smaller flash memory versions meant to compete directly with the popular iPod Nano. They were functionally better, but still required the proprietary software and still had the crippling sharing limits. Then came the Zune 120 inches 2008, which was a high-capacity model with a better screen, specifically competing with the high-end iPod Classic. It was a constant effort to chase Apple's various product lines. The Zune HD launched in 2009. This was truly the last gasp of the brand, and ironically, it was the best device they ever made. It represented the peak of Zune engineering. It featured an absolutely gorgeous OLED screen, a capacitive touch interface that was incredibly slick and responsive, and even had an integrated HD radio receiver. It was purely on specs, arguably technologically superior to the iPod Touch of the same era. But here's the colossal problem. By the time the Zune HD finally arrived on the market, the portable music race wasn't about dedicated music players anymore. The entire landscape had changed completely. The world had fundamentally and rapidly changed, leaving the Zune behind. The market shift was massive and unforgiving. The true final nail in the Zune's coffin. The technological shift that made the entire concept of a standalone music player obsolete was the iPhone. This single product changed everything. When the original Zune launched in 2006, the iPhone was only 6 months away from being publicly announced. Microsoft completely failed to anticipate the coming mobile revolution. By the time the beautiful but doomed Zune HD arrived in 2009, the superior iPhone 3GS was already out. The smartphone had completely revolutionized the idea of a portable media device. Why would any consumer buy a separate, limited device just for music when their phone, which they carried everywhere, could do it better? The phone could also handle applications, browse the web, and offered a completely open and massive app store. Microsoft was perpetually one step behind Apple. They were busy catching up to the iPod right as Apple was moving past it into the smartphone era. It was a tragic misalignment of strategy and timing. The Zune was suddenly an artifact of the past, even in its final, most advanced iteration. It was a great MP3 player in a world that no longer needed MP3 players at all. The product category it belonged to had become obsolete. As if the years of market failure weren't enough, the Zune managed to create one last spectacular technology scandal right at the end of 2010. It was a final, embarrassing, self-inflicted wound. On the 31st of December 2010, owners of the original Zune 30 woke up to find their devices completely bricked. They wouldn't turn on, wouldn't sync, nothing worked. The devices were utterly useless on New Year's Eve. The cause of this massive technical disaster? A catastrophic internal clock bug related to the handling of leap years. The Zune 30's internal clock calculation failed spectacularly on the 366th day of 2008. Since 2010 was not a leap year, the calendar rollover logic went haywire when it tried to reconcile the dates. Over 1 million Zune 30 devices were effectively killed by an internal date bug at the worst possible time. People's travel music, their party playlists, all gone on a holiday. It was a final, embarrassing, and fittingly technical disaster to punctuate the product's troubled history. Microsoft eventually issued a software fix, but the damage to the brand's credibility was absolute and permanent. In October 2011, Microsoft officially discontinued the Zune hardware line. The brand lingered briefly as a software platform for a few years, eventually being folded into the Xbox Music and then finally the Groove Music services, before being retired completely. The story of the Microsoft Zune is one of the most instructive tech fails in modern history. It offers critical lessons on market strategy and product development. What are the key lessons we take away from this classic technology scandal? First, you cannot compete with established brand loyalty by simply imitating the leader. The Zune was often just as good or slightly better on specs alone, but it lacked the soul and ecosystem of the iPod. Apple didn't sell a gadget, they sold a lifestyle and a seamless experience. Microsoft sold a technical specification sheet. When you enter a mature market, you must offer a compelling, truly revolutionary reason for consumers to switch. The Zune's limited file sharing gimmick was definitely not it. Second, timing is absolutely everything. Never be late to the party. The 5-year gap between the iPod and the Zune proved to be completely insurmountable. By 2006, the market was fully saturated, and brand allegiances were fiercely set. Microsoft was constantly playing catch-up, which drained resources that could have been better spent on developing the next big thing, like, say, a competitive mobile phone operating system to directly challenge the iPhone. Third, ecosystems must be open and intuitive, not insular and complex. The proprietary software, the lack of Mac support, and the confusing marketplace setup all serve to put a frustrating wall between the user and their music. Simplicity and compatibility always win the consumer battle. Ultimately, the Microsoft Zune was a multi-million-dollar admission that Microsoft simply did not understand the fast-moving consumer electronics landscape of the 2000s. It's a tragic tale of a company with unlimited resources, a decent product, and absolutely no insight into what the consumer truly wanted next. The Zune may be gone forever, but its square, brown shadow serves as a perpetual reminder that in tech, you don't win by being second. You win by being the one who changes the game entirely. The Zune was trying desperately to perfect a game that Apple had already finished playing, and that is a failure story for the ages. It is a perfect example of a major technical disaster through strategic failure. What do you think? Did you ever own a Zune? Do you, against all odds, still have a working one somewhere in a drawer? Let us know all about your Zune experience in the comments below. Be sure to hit that like button right now and subscribe to Tech Fails so you don't miss our next deep dive into a historical technical disaster. Thank you for watching our analysis of this classic technology scandal. Until next time, this is Tech Fails, signing off. We'll see you soon.